We are going to be in Proverbs chapters 30 and 31 today. So if you would like to be called on to read specifically, then you can go to the Bible Study React channel and react to the message there. I removed the previous reactions just so that we didn't have last week's there. So go ahead and go over there. You gotta have a microphone, of course. And then I'll just ask you to read a small section of the passage. All right, so let's go ahead and do some review real quick. So we're in the book of Proverbs right now, and this is going to be our last study on Proverbs. So we start off with our study of Proverbs all the way to the beginning, where we were looking at who the author was, and it was mostly written by Solomon, but we have a couple other sections, such as in chapter 30, we have the words of Agur. Chapter 31, we have the words of King Lemuel. So we have other people involved in Proverbs. And if we look at Proverbs chapter 25, verse 1, we see an interesting title here. These also are Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, transcribed. So this basically means that we have some editors on the book of Proverbs. It's not just King Solomon. They're also the men of Hezekiah, who came a couple hundred years after King Solomon. So if they were the last people to have a hand in the book of Proverbs, and we have no reason to think differently, all the material dates very old as well, and we don't have any other indication of other editors or authors. So we're looking at a date at around 700 BC, a couple hundred years after King Solomon's reign. And these were most likely the people who included Agur's words and King Lemuel's words at the end, kind of put the whole collection together. These were the men of Hezekiah, and that's what they did basically. So in our review, we started off with chapter 1 verses 1 to 7, kind of the introduction section. Verse 1 gives you the title of this particular section, Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. Now here they are. And then verses 2 to 6 give us the audience and the purpose of Proverbs. Purpose to know wisdom and instruction. Purpose to discern the sayings of understanding, and so on. And then you see a little bit about the intended audience. To give prudence to the naive. To the youth, knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. And verse 7 gives us the motto of the book of Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And this is one of the main themes that's carried out through the book of Proverbs, and you'll hear it repeated from time to time elsewhere in the book of Proverbs as well. So I sent you guys a little outline in the chat there. So this is from Derek Kidner's commentary. We have a nice little outline. You have the title, introduction, and motto, verses 1 to 7. And then you have a father's praise of wisdom. That starts in chapter 1, verse 8 to chapter 9, verse 18. These are the longer discourses, more of along the lines of, my son, do this, my son, don't do that. They're very easy to categorize topically. And then we got into the Proverbs of Solomon again, from chapter 10 to 22:16. These are the short, pithy sayings, so usually about a verse long, and that kind of can stand on its own. They're harder to categorize and organize, but we've come up with some methods to do that in our previous studies. And then in section 3, the words of wise men, chapter 22, verse 17 to chapter 24, verse 22. This was Solomon's own take on a wisdom writing called the Instruction of Amenemope. That was an ancient Egyptian wisdom piece, and he was basically talking about it and writing on that because he knew that his audience would be familiar with that ancient wisdom literature, and he goes on and basically improves on it, corrects it, and he says in the parts that are the same, yeah, this is good advice here, and I'm going to include it for all of you. But there are some other areas that, could be improved on, and some areas that could be corrected from, a Jewish Hebrew perspective as opposed to a pagan Egyptian perspective. But Amenemope got a couple things right. And so Solomon just kind of built on that in this section. And 24, 23 to 34 is further words of wise men. And you have those titles at the beginning of those sections if you want to look at them. I just introduce the sections as, here are words of wise men. Listen to my instruction. And then we have section 4, further Proverbs of Solomon. This starts in chapter 25, verse 1, the part we read where Hezekiah's men were speaking and saying, these also are Proverbs of Solomon, which we transcribed or we copied and recorded. And then chapter 30, which we're going to be into today, the words of Agur. Chapter 31, which we'll also cover, the words of King Lemuel. And then that ends this section with an alphabet of wifely excellence. Chapter 31, verses 10 to 31. And it's called an alphabet or an acrostic because it just goes through the Hebrew alphabet. And you start off one verse with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph. Then you go to Beit, the second letter, and so on, Gimel, Dalet, Hey. And we'll get into that. I'll give you a screenshot of what that kind of looks like when we get to that section. But any questions on the summary so far? All right, I will assume no questions. And welcome new people. We are going to be in chapters 30 and 31 of Proverbs. If you would like to volunteer to read, just go to the Bible Study React channel there, and you can just react to that message, and then I'll have a list of people that I can call on to read. So the first person is Dogman. Hopefully we'll get more people on the list. So we're going to be in chapter 30 of Proverbs. These are the words of Agur. And Dogman, could you please read verses 1 to 10?
Sure. I'm reading from the NASB 1995. All right. The man declares to Ithiel, and to Ukal. Wait, hold on. The words of Agur, the son of Jakeh the oracle. The man declares to Ithiel, and to Ukal. Surely I am more stupid than any man, and I do not have the understanding of a man. Neither have I learned wisdom, nor do I have the knowledge of the Holy One, who has descended into heaven and descended, who has gathered the wind in his fists, who has wrapped the waters in his garment, who has established all the ends of the earth. What is his name or his son's name? Surely you know. Every word of God is tested. He is a shield to those who take refuge in him. Do not add to his words, or he will reprove you, and you will be proved a liar. 2 things I ask of you. Do not refuse me before I die. Keep deception and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is my portion, that I not be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or that I not be in want and steal and profane the name of my God. Do not slander a slave to his master, or he will curse you and you will be found guilty.
All right, thanks. So that was the first section that we're going to look at. That was verses 1 to 10. And let me give you guys a little outline of this section of chapter 30. So this is what we're looking at. These are basically areas where you can divide chapter 30. So we have the prologue, the introduction, verses 1 to 6. Verse 1 specifically is the title. These are the words of Agur, son of Jakeh the oracle. I don't know how you'd pronounce that in English, but in Hebrew you just say Yakeh. But in English you might say Jakeh, Jakey, something like that. Whatever works, basically. And then you have verses 7 to 9, which is a numerical saying, which is a new kind of collection. We saw a couple numerical ideas previously in Proverbs, but this is pretty much a new kind of collection in chapter 30. And if you look down at the outline, you see numerical saying, numerical saying, numerical saying. So, what this kind of tells me is that Agur likes numbers a lot. He uses a lot of numbers. He uses a lot of numerical sayings. And if you look at verse 7, 2 things I asked of you. So that's where you get the number from. That's why it's called a numerical saying. Well, take care, quadratic formula. Your name is also another numerical saying. A little more mathematical, though. And verse 10 is just an individual proverb kind of stands on its own. It's not part of the numerical saying before, and it's not part of the next collection, which is a thematic collection, which involves just a theme and some catchwords. So we're going to do kind of the same thing that we did last week, where I just called on people down the list to give maybe a quick summary, maybe an application, or even just asking a question. So these are the different options that you have. So I'll just call on the first two people. I won't do it yet. Just giving you guys a heads up. It'll be beget and burn. I'll ask you guys to, okay, from verses 1 to 10, anything in there, you could summarize a small section of that, maybe just the prologue, maybe verses 7 to 9, the numerical saying. You can summarize that, or you could give an application on a specific portion of the text there. You could also ask a question. That's a good one if you don't know what to say. You just, I'm confused on this part. What does it mean? And you could also point out a theme that you kind of see going through there. So before I ask you to, let's look at verse 1 real quick, because it brings up some interesting questions, mostly in the realm of translation. So the issue with verse 1 is that it's very difficult to translate. And there are two major ways to do it. So if you compare translations, sometimes you'll see the man declares to Ithiel and Ukal, which is what the NASB does, and that's what Dogman just read. So in other words, we're translating these particular Hebrew words as proper names, Ithiel and Ukal. Now the issue with that is there are no very easy designators in the Hebrew language, such as capital letters saying this is a proper name, and even with the original manuscripts there weren't any spaces between words. So it becomes difficult to decide, is this a person's name or is this a noun or a verb or something like that? Another difficulty is that oftentimes Hebrew names were based on verbs and nouns and were meant to mean something, such as the Lord is my Savior or the Lord saves and things like that. So are you talking about a name or are you talking about, a statement of meaning? So that's the difficulty here. Some translators translate as proper names Ithiel, and Ukal, and other translators actually translate in a different way. So let me just read from the commentary. Another alternative is, I am weary, O God, I am weary and exhausted. And the NIV kind of gives you something in between there. This man's utterance to Ithiel, I am weary, God, but I can prevail. So some translations just translate Ithiel and Ithiel both as I am weary, and then repeated I am weary, to stress that emphasis there. So those are basically two major options. You can either translate it as to Ithiel, and Ukal. You could translate Ithiel's name as I am weary, and sometimes you could say to Ithiel, I am weary. Sometimes it's just I am weary again. So I just wanted to bring that out in case you were comparing translations, in case your translation might have said something different than the NASB, which is what Dogman was reading. It's not a big issue, it's just a title, and most importantly, we have the options in front of us. It's not like we have no idea on how to translate it, but we have all the options right there, and that's pretty much all I'll say on that. We don't need to look at it anymore. So just know that there are some options. Do you mean the verse, beget? Because I can post the verse. Yep, this is the section that we just read, verses 1 to 10, and now I'll call on you, beget and burn, to go ahead and do one of the four things. You could summarize a portion of that, give an application, ask a question, or point out a theme for that section. Whenever you're ready. Oh, that's a good question, beget. We can answer that after Burn gives her take on the passage. And everyone else can think of that question too. So while Burn is thinking, And if you do look at the ESV, you'll see another translation. The man declares, I am weary, O God, I am weary, O God, and worn out. So that's another option. That's the one that translates Ithiel's name both times as I am weary. So maybe Byrne is AFK, I don't know. But maybe she can pop in, say something in the chat if she's not. So for Beget's question, what do you guys think? If we were going to go with the ESV's translation here, or the NIV's translation, what would make Agur weary? Why is he weary? What do you guys think? The hint is to look at the latter context there. Just keep reading on.
I mean, it seems like, just from the immediate context, that he's weary because even amidst all of his knowledge, he feels as though he doesn't know God. I don't know if that's an accurate statement of actually his condition before God. I don't think it is, but I think it's him realizing how little he knows of God, meaning in a personal sort of sense, how much he knows really God, because he says, I'm weary and worn out, surely I'm too stupid to be a man. I have not the understanding of a man. I have not learned wisdom, nor have I knowledge of the Holy One. So it could also be just him feeling weary, because the more you know, the more you realize that you don't know. There's that too. So if it's in a wisdom knowledge sense and not a knowing God personally sense, then it would definitely be the more you know, the more you realize you don't know, kind of thing. And I think in verse 4 it kind of talks a little bit about that. Who has ascended to heaven and come down? Who has gathered the wind in his fists? Who has wrapped up the waters in a garment? Who has established all the ends of the earth? What is his name, and what is his son's name? Surely you know. I think that's a pretty cool one. You know, what's his son's name? Yeah. But we see Christ there, and I think maybe it's both somehow, that he feels as though he looks at God and he sees how awesome and sovereign God is, and how, you know, God is the one who is in heaven. You know, honestly, verse 4 sounds a lot like Jesus, honestly. Who has ascended to heaven and come down? No one except the Son of Man. John 3. Jesus talked about that. No one has come from heaven and seen God except for the one who's from heaven, Christ. He said that of himself. So there's a lot of Jesus right here, you know, in this verse that we can see. It's really, really cool. But for Agur, yeah, I think that's going to be my final answer.
All right, yeah.
Oh, wait, one more thing.
Go ahead.
One more thing. This is something I've experienced. So when you begin to dissect the scriptures and try to apply them very practically and form a sound worldview and philosophy based on them, there's always this fear, at least for me, of verse 6. Do not add to his words, lest he rebuke you and you be found a liar. And then there's the flip side, don't take away from his words. So that's what in Revelation it says, if you add to his words, God will add the plagues. If you remove from his words, you know, he'll remove your name from the book of life. Pretty severe. And so there's this sense as a pastor, as a teacher, which is what I'm training to be, Lord willing. And just as a Christian, when you study these things, that you're afraid of, like, oh, I don't want to add anything to the scriptures. You just want to understand, but you don't want to add your own understanding. You don't want to, oh, there was a word for it. We want to be exegetical, what was the other? Hermeneutics and exegesis. We don't want to be I don't know how to say it. We don't want to be putting things in. We don't want to be eisegetical, which means putting things into the text. We want to be exegetical and extracting from the text and understanding it and letting it change us and our perspective. So, could be feeling a little bit of that too.
Yeah, certainly a lot of good stuff there, and I would definitely agree with what you've said there. I don't think we should take this objectively and say, well, this writer was just stupid or anything like that. But relatively speaking, as he's comparing himself to God and comparing to himself to all the other things that he doesn't know, yeah, he is stupid. He doesn't have understanding. The more he learns, the more he realizes he just doesn't know. And I think everyone else got on that as well. Roro said perhaps he's also realizing life's futility, perhaps. And, it does seem like he has some kind of exasperation as he goes on throughout the rest of this chapter, talking about, wicked people and the things they do, feeling exasperated about that, and that perhaps contributes to his weariness. And Liji points out verse 9, which was good as well. So, in verse 9 and all the other verses where he does talk about God in correct terms, we can say that, okay, it's not that he has zero knowledge of God. It's that, relatively speaking, and that God is so infinite and beyond his full comprehension. There are things that he can just say that I just don't have any understanding, especially relatively speaking. So yeah, that was all good stuff. And that was verses 1 to 10. Matt also brought up, looking at verse 4, what is his name or his son's name? And our commentary brings up that the Christian interpreter can't help but think of the Son of God here and recall that he came down from above to reveal the truth to his people. He also cites John chapter 3, which Matt did. So who has ascended into heaven and descended? Well, as Christians, we know who that is. And since God is the only possible answer to the questions here, and then we talk about God's Son, it's striking that the text speaks of his Son. Very striking indeed. All right. Any final thoughts that anyone would like to add, or any questions on verses 1 to 10? So Snorlax brings up the point that his weariness could be from attempting to over-intellectualize God, rather than simply forming a relationship with God. And that's also a possibility. Kind of what Matt hinted at as well. Well, perhaps the understanding and knowledge of the Holy One that Agur is talking about here has to do with experiential knowledge. So that's certainly a possibility there. So Roro asks a really good question. Why or how did Agur write about the Son when he didn't know about Jesus? How would you guys answer that question?
There's actually a verse in the New Testament that I was just listening to today, and I believe it was in Peter, where he was saying that the things that were written for our sake. They were written for us, and not for their sake. So whether it's prophets or prophecies or they strained it. There's a verse that says they strained. They were looking forward to what was being said, but they didn't understand it. They didn't get the full understanding of what they were saying. It was revealed to them in part, and in that sense, different parts. Isaiah emphasizes one thing, and Amos another, and all the prophets emphasize different parts and play an important part of the puzzle of who Christ would be in fulfillment. So, yeah. Essentially, they didn't know, but the Holy Spirit was speaking through them.
Yeah, like Fang said, the Holy Spirit moves in interesting ways for the authors. And I would also point out that in verse 3, starting it off, he says, I don't have knowledge of the Holy One. And then he asks a number of questions. Now, perhaps you could come up with an answer to some of these questions, and perhaps not, such as who has ascended into heaven and descended. Who is that exactly? Other than, Christ that we know about. So we know that God does reside in heaven, but who's ascended and descended? So those are questions there. Some of those questions, are easily answerable. Who has established all the ends of the earth? And then he asks some questions that might be done ironically. What is his son's name? What is his name or his son's name? So you probably know his name, but what about his son's name? Surely could be, meaning, some of these answers, but also you don't know some of those answers, talking about the original audience there. Surely kind of speaking ironically there. And especially in the context of verse 3, nor do I have knowledge of the Holy One. So yeah, I would say that the author isn't fully aware of Jesus Christ, but he's asking these questions, and the Holy Spirit's guiding him to those questions to pave the way for the New Testament, where we can actually answer those questions. pretty easily. All right, let's get into the next section now. And scrolling up, we see that we finished verse 10, and there's a lot to read, but we can go ahead and read verses 11 to 20. And this gets us into 4 different collections. So we start off with a thematic collection, which just has a theme there. And as we're reading verses 11 to 14, try to look for that theme. And 15 to 16 is another numerical saying, because it has a number in it. And 17, individual proverb. 18 to 20 is another numerical saying. And we have another reactor. So we have Tia. Tia, could you please read verses 11 to 20?
Yeah, so I'm reading from the NKJV version. Okay, there is a generation that curses its father and does not bless its mother. There is a generation that is pure in its own eyes, yet it is not washed from its filthiness. There is a generation, how lofty are their eyes, and their eyelids are lifted up. There is a generation whose teeth are like swords and whose fangs are like knives, to devour the poor from all the earth and the needy from among men. The leech has 2 daughters, give and give. There are 3 things that are never satisfied, or never say enough: the grave, barren wood, the earth that is not satisfied with water, and the fire never says enough. The eye that mocks his father and scorns obedience to his mother, the ravens of the valleys would pick it out, and the young eagle will eat it. There are 3 things which are too wonderful for me, yes, which I do not understand: the way of an eagle in the air, the way of a serpent on a rock, the way of a ship in the midst of the sea, and the way of a man with a virgin. This is the way of an adulterous woman. She eats and wipes her mouth, says, I have done wickedness.
All right, so that was verses 11 to 20. Just remember that we're looking at 4 different collections here. So, kind of split up quite a bit. We're just reading it in larger parts because it's easier and faster that way. So, Dogman and Dezaboa, what do you guys want to, bring up about this? And here are your 4 options. Either one of you can start. And when you're answering one of those questions, just keep in mind that it's best to do that inside of one collection. So don't try to summarize the entire verse 11 to 20. Just go in, okay, I'll try to summarize verses 11 to 14, or maybe 18 to 20 in those collections that the outline says. All right, I'll call on Dogman first then. Dogman, do you have any ideas?
Yeah, I think so like 11 to 14, he just keeps saying there is a kind of man who curses his father, and there is a kind of keeps saying there is a person like this, and it seems like he's going to say at the end, be careful with this guy, but he doesn't say be careful with this guy. He just says that there is a kind of man that with these traits. And I think what you have to take away from this is that you have to these are like things that you can look for, I guess. I guess this is just like making you aware to seek wisdom and being able to tell what is a bad kind of man, what type of guy that you should avoid.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And you got to the theme as well. There is a kind of man. That's pretty much the theme, and it describes that kind of man, a wicked man. And it's assumed and implied that we should be wary and watch out for that kind of man.
Yes.
All right, what about you, Deza? What do you want to add to that? Not adding to the words of Scripture, of course, as verses 1 to 10 have said, but, putting out your own thoughts about what Scripture has already said. So he brings up a question, and I'll bring that question out to you guys. Verse 17, the eye that mocks a father. So this is the individual proverb in this section, and it kind of stands on its own. Doesn't go with the previous numerical saying or the latter one. But how can an eye mock a father? What do you guys think? Yeah, that's all right, Burn. No worries. So yeah, perhaps looking down on him, maybe being condescending. You know, when you tilt your head back and you kind of look down at someone. That's a definite possibility. Yeah, perhaps simply not respecting his authority. Maybe, at least in modern contemporary times, the way you could do that would be in rolling your eyes. I don't know if that applies back then, though, but in some way you're not respecting the father's authority. Yeah, and that's a good connection there. It's not just eyes that mock a father, it's the same eyes that scorn the mother. So yeah, I think you're talking about Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, where Ham, apparently did mock his father somehow, and his other 2 sons, they looked away, walked backwards, put a blanket or a cloak over their father, respectfully. So I think we've come up with a number of good specifics on how eyes can mock a father and scorn a mother. And we also have some generalities as well by not respecting his authority. And Deza brings up the 5th commandment. We should respect our mother and fathers. And Solomon would definitely be familiar with that. Hezekiah's men who put in Agur's sayings as part of this collection would also be familiar with the 5th commandment, of course. So yeah, and it seems that the verse is kind of broad, kind of ambiguous, doesn't give you the specifics on how eyes can do that, so probably leaves it open for many options on how eyes can mock. So yeah, really good stuff. So another couple things that I want to bring up is that if you look at the outline, you'll notice that not only are these numerical sayings, verses 15 to 16 and 18 to 20, but they're also riddles. So the leech has 2 daughters, verse 15, give and give. So who are those 2 daughters? Exactly. Well, they are apparently people or things that can't be satiated. They keep leeching, they're kind of parasitic. And it makes you think about what that would be. And in verses 18 to 20, it's another riddle. There are 3 things which are too wonderful for me, for which I don't understand. The way of an eagle in the sky, the way of a serpent on a rock, the way of a ship in the middle of the sea, and the way of a man with a maid. And then, kind of culminating, this is the way of an adulterous woman. She eats and wipes her mouth and says, I have done no wrong. And maybe you were confused on this passage a little bit. Like, what does an eagle and snake and a ship in the middle of the sea have in common? And the way of a man with a maid. So, let me just quickly bring out the commentary here, because this is a tricky riddle, and it takes some time to think about. So I'll just bring out the commentary. A better solution, he gives a number of other options, but a better solution is that the eagle, the snake, and the ship can cross the sky, a rock, or the sea, and leave no tracks. No trace of their passing through remains. The link between these 3 and the way that a man, whether the young woman is, in which serves as a clue. The link between these 3 and the way of a man with a young woman is in verse 20, which serves a clue. Wiping her mouth after eating means that the adulteress treats sexual liaisons the same way she does eating. She just finishes up and goes home without a care, and certainly without a sense of guilt. So that is our commentary's interpretation of that riddle, and I think it's a pretty good one. It's certainly a tough riddle to try to figure out what the link is between those things. So let's get into the next section then. We're going to kind of go a little faster here. So next person to read is Dogman again. So Dogman, could you read verses 21 to 33? Just finish that chapter off.
Sure. NASB 1995. All right. Under three things the earth quakes, and under 4 it cannot bear up. Under a slave when he becomes king, and a fool when he is satisfied with food. Under an unloved woman when she gets a husband, and a maidservant when she supplants her mistress. 4 things are small on the earth, but they are exceedingly wise. The ants are not a strong people, but they prepare their food in the summer. The Shephanim are not mighty people, yet they make their houses on the rocks. The locusts have no king, yet all of them go out in ranks. The lizard you may grasp with the hands, yet it is in kings' palaces. There are 3 things which are stately in their march, even 4 which are stately when they walk. The lion which is mighty among beasts, and does not retreat before any. The strutting rooster, the male goat also, and a king when his army is with him. If you have been foolish in exalting yourself, or if you have plotted evil, put your hand on your mouth. For the churning of milk produces butter, and pressing the nose brings forth blood. So the churning of anger produces strife.
All right. So that was verses 21 to 33, finishing off chapter 30, which is Agur's section. And you'll notice a lot of numbers in there, a lot of numbered items, lots of numerical sayings. And the next 2 people I'll call on would be Fang and Tia. But before that, while they're thinking, I want to bring out a little bit on, let's see, verse 21, I think. If I can find that. This is also a chiasm, and it's also a parallel collection at the same time. So this is verses 21 to 23. So if you compare that in your Bible, if you have it open, you'll see that as we're looking here, we'll see male servant becomes king, and then the male fool is sated with food. That's topic B, switches from kingliness to now we're talking about something about satisfaction, sated. And then we go into B, the female is deprived of love. So instead of being sated, satisfied, she's now deprived of love. And then in topic A again, the female servant becomes mistress. So it's a chiasm because we go in with servant becomes king, talking about a servant. Then we switch topics, talking about being satisfied or not being satisfied. And then we switch topics again to the servant. But it's also a parallel because we're going male, male, then female, female. So I just wanted to point that out, that there is some complexity to this entire chapter. Just like throughout all of Proverbs, there's some complexity to that. There's patterns and order to it. You don't have to remember that, this particular pattern, but just know that there's still patterns going on in this section as well. All right, Fang and Tia, what do you guys want to contribute to the section that we just read, verses 21 to 33?
Okay, so verses 20 to 28 practically summarizing that. There are 4 things which are little on earth, but they are exceedingly wise. To me, that's saying, no matter how young you are, how people perceive you, how weak you think you are, whatever, you all serve purpose, and you can all be wise. Practically, they were bringing up different types of animals that are considered to be weaker than usual and in number, but saying they can still do all this. They are still good. They are still very wise. Yeah.
Yeah, what verses are you specifically looking at there?
Verses 24 to 28. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. So that is an interesting one. We got a number of options there. He goes through a lot of different illustrations, and he kind of talks about something that might be looked at as a weakness for those things. The ants are not strong. But then he goes into a positive. But they prepare their food in the summer. The Shephanim are not mighty people, but they make their houses on the rocks. The locusts have no king, but they go out in ranks. And the lizard is very common. You can grasp it with your hands, but you can also see it in kings' palaces. So yeah, what about you, Fang? What do you want to put in there for the 4 questions? That's interesting. So what are the options that you've seen for that? Gotcha. So yeah, that is an interesting question. So looking at verse 23, the NASB says, under an unloved woman. And the question is, of course, how do we translate the word unloved? Sometimes we see perhaps maybe hated even. Some translations render that as hated, some render it as disliked. Some translations say unloved, like the NASB. According to Fang, apparently, divorced is another option. So that could be a possibility, which would get a lot more specific. And I don't know what the translation we should go with would be, but here are some options. These aren't contextual options, but just some options that we could gloss that word as. We could render it as hated or unloved, shunned, perhaps a foe. So divorce would be a very specific translation that would interpret it for you a little bit. The general sense would be someone who has been hated, someone who has been unloved, at least. So unloved, that's kind of a general translation. Probably, I would say, the safest translation. If you go with hated, you're getting a stronger word, and you're also implying that other people have specifically hated her and shunned her. Either way, it's an interesting question. So yeah, like Fang said, is she a victim or is she guilty of wrongdoing herself? So yeah, interesting stuff. And that's in the context of the numerical saying in verses 21 to 23, 3 things which the earth quakes, and under 4 it cannot bear up. So these are pretty groundbreaking, kind of crazy things, wild things that are happening under a slave when he becomes king. That's a wild thing to happen. The earth quakes under that. It can barely hold itself up with that. A fool when he's satisfied with food. An unloved woman when she gets a husband. A maidservant when she supplants her mistress. So perhaps a hated woman when she gets a husband, an unloved woman. So that would be pretty wild for someone like that to get a husband. But it's possible. It's a possibility. It's not saying that it's a bad thing. It's not saying that any of this stuff is wrong necessarily. But certainly interesting. All right, let's get to the next section then. Unless anyone has any questions or comments on verses 21 to 33.
I'll just add in there that I think one of the translations would be, the earth cannot bear an unloved woman when she is married. I think that the proper translation of that, in my opinion, would be, it cannot bear a married woman who is not loved. Like someone who's married and is not loved by her husband. And in the New Testament, it says that. It says in the New Testament, husbands, love your wives and live with understanding. And wives, respect your husbands and, in a godly sense, submit to them. And so I think that's the way I read it. I've never been able to read it any other way. Like, an unloved woman when she is married. For me, that doesn't really do anything. But to think of a married woman who is unloved, now that is something the earth cannot bear. It's like the bare basic commandment of God. In being fruitful and multiplying is not just being fruitful and multiplying. It includes loving one another, caring for one another, raising a family. It's the whole 9 yards. That's just built into our existence as like human beings, not even as Christians. And so, yet as Christians, we are commanded the correct moral standards, but you don't have to be a Christian to realize there's something seriously wrong if a husband doesn't love his wife.
Yeah, that brings up another question.
At least generally.
Let me just interrupt you there. That brings up another question, in that if we do go by the translation unloved, does the woman remain unloved after she gets a husband?
Can I try to bring up thing? Because there is the thing after that. And it was just a thought that I don't know. And it says, and a maidservant who succeeds her mistress. Could it be talking about the guy being unfaithful and mistresses and maidservants? Yeah. And not the person involved because he couldn't love his wife? Yeah.
That's a possibility. We might not be able to make too close a connection there because the previous one didn't have much of a connection in itself or to this one. So the previous verse would be, under a slave when he becomes king, and a fool when he's satisfied with food. So I say that we're talking about two different scenarios here. But it's certainly interesting. And for Roro's question, what does it mean that the earth trembles? Real quickly, I think it's simply that these are just crazy happenstance instances that tend to go against the common way, normal way that things go. So a slave doesn't usually become a king or anything like that. So I think it's just basically a metaphor for something crazy happening. All right, let's get into the next chapter then. This is the last chapter of Proverbs, last chapter of our Proverbs study. And this is probably the most popular chapter of Proverbs as well, because it has the description of the woman, the hardworking woman, the diligent woman. And before that, though, we're going to read verses 1 to 9, which give us the first part of this whole section. So, Tia, could you please read verses 1 to 9 of chapter 31?
Sure. The words of King Lemuel, the utterance which his mother taught him. What, my son, and what son of my womb, and what son of my vows? Do not give your strength to women, nor your ways to that which destroys kings. It is not for kings, Lemuel. It is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes intoxicated in drink, lest they drink and forget the and pervert the justice of the afflicted. Give strong drink to him who is perishing, and wine to those who are bitter of heart. Let him drink and forget his poverty, and remember his misery. Open your mouth for the speechless, in the cause to die. Open your mouth, judge righteously, and plead the cause of the needy.
Wonderful.
I forgot this stuff, but yeah.
Yeah, you got it. So that was verses 1 to 9 of chapter 31, words of King Lemuel. And this brings up some interesting questions that I'll bring up first. The next two people I'll call on would be Tia again and Try. So you can be thinking of what you want to bring up about this passage. So this brings up some interesting questions because we're introduced to it as a section of King Lemuel, the oracle or utterance which his mother taught him. But then if we look at verses 10 to 31, we see things kind of shifting gears. Okay, we were obviously in a motherly tone in verses 1 to 9. What, O son of my womb, and what, O son of my vows? Do not, and it goes and gives us motherly instruction. But if we look at verses 10 to 31, we don't see that anymore. And we also see a massive shift in both the kind of content. I mean, we could still consider this as being, here's motherly instruction about, a woman, a wife for you to find, King Lemuel. But we do see that massive shift in content and especially in style. So the first section is kind of a discourse, kind of a scattered list of, here are some important things that you should know. And in verses 10 to 31, it's more focused, and literary-wise, it's in an acrostic form, which verses 1 to 9 we're not in. And the acrostic is just and I'll send you a screenshot after we read this, but acrostic is just going through the Hebrew alphabet, and each line starts with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and then it goes to the next letter of the alphabet, and then the next letter going down. So it's a massive difference in style, which has led some scholars to think that verses 10 to 31 were written by someone else, other than King Lemuel. The issue, though, is that you can't be too certain about that. It's certainly possible that King Lemuel still wrote this section, and Dwayne Garrett seems to lean on the idea that King Lemuel wrote both of the sections, and I would strengthen his argument by saying that we don't see a title in verse 10 setting it off as a different section by a different author, or even inspired by a different author, whereas everywhere else in Proverbs we've seen titles setting off these different sections. Here are the Proverbs of Solomon. Here are sayings of the wise. Here are the words of Agur. Here are the words of King Lemuel. So in every other instance where we had a shift in authorship, even a shift in slightly different material, Proverbs has always done well to point that out with a little title. So I don't know the answer, but I would say that it's probably best to consider both of these sections as written by King Lemuel. So hopefully that has given you guys a little bit of time. So Tia and Try, you have 4 options for things you can bring out of the passage if you'd like. What would you want to bring up? What do you want to bring up?
Something that was interesting to me was 4 to 7. This is 4 to 7. It said, "It is not for kings or Lemuel. It is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes intoxicating drink, to drink and forget the Lord." So over here, I feel like they the directly saying, "Hosts, do not drink, do not become, well, you can kind of, but don't become drunk, because when you become drunk, you won't be right set, and you possibly forget all the commandments and laws that you were, and pervert justice practically by doing things that you allowed to." Yeah, give strong drink to him who is perishing, and wine to those who are bitter of heart. So the interesting thing here that I was like, so people that drink are allowed to drink to get the are going through, and I was like, that's a question I would bring up, because like, is that a thing though? Yeah.
Yeah, that was really interesting stuff. So King Lemuel's mother is apparently holding King Lemuel to a higher standard because of his kingship. And that's all this whole section is in the context of advice for King Lemuel as a king. So it does seem to be a very strong, basically, exclusion of wine. It's not for kings to drink wine. It doesn't bring up any exceptions to that. But we do see that the king should have a higher standard there. We also see other instances where it is okay, give strong drink to him who is perishing and wine to him whose life is bitter. But yeah, very interesting stuff. So the application you can make from that would be looking at the principle there. If you are held to a higher standard, you should be a lot more careful about your alcohol consumption. So how about you, Try? I don't know if you're here with us, but anything you want to bring up about this passage, if you're here? I see you unmuted, but I don't hear you, unfortunately. I still don't hear you, Try, sorry. Still nothing. Maybe the microphone needs to be set in the settings, perhaps. Yeah, typing's fine too. So yeah, maybe you could just type it out, Try, and hopefully we could get that fixed later on. But you can go ahead and type, and we'll just read the next section. And I know we still have a bunch of people who haven't volunteered, well, haven't had me call on them to volunteer to contribute their thoughts, but we'll just read the next section, and then I'll just call on everyone who hasn't volunteered yet to just go ahead and give their take on the passage, give their thoughts and anything they can draw out of the passage. So the next section is verses 10 to 31. And we have a couple other reactors, actually. So we have Hat and Malki. So we'll split this in half, but we'll read it all in one portion, in one time. So Hat, could you read verses 10 to 20? And then Malki, right after Hat finishes verse 20, just read verses 21 to 31. Just finish that chapter off.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So from the ESV, an excellent wife who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from afar. She rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and portions for her maidens. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands, she plants a vineyard. She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hand to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy.
Reading from the New King James Version, verse 21. She is not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household is clothed with scarlet. She makes tapestry for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them, and supplies sashes for the merchants. Strength and honor are her clothing. She shall rejoice in time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and on her tongue is the law of kindness. He watches over the ways of her household, and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many daughters have done well, but you excel them all. Charm is deceitful and beauty is passing, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her own words praise her in the gates.
Wonderful. So that was the last section of chapter 31, and we read that in two little parts just to have multiple readers who volunteered. And real quickly, back to what Tri said when we're reading verses 1 to 9, the theme I noticed is that the mother seems to be advising her son to reject things that are vanity. That would certainly be one of the themes in verses 1 to 9. And if we are still considering King Lemuel having written verses 10 to 31 as well, then we're probably looking at this in the context of King Lemuel's mother wanting her son to find a good wife and to look for these qualities of a good wife. And on the other hand, it's easily applicable to women as well, because we are talking about an excellent wife, and those same qualities would be, very applicable. So for everyone who has not volunteered yet, hasn't been called on specifically, so that would be Lard, Malky, Rami, Roro, and everyone down the list there, under Lard basically. For all of you people, what do you guys want to bring up for this passage? You can do one of four things for this. You could summarize it, you could give an application, ask a question, or point out the theme. That's verses 10 to 31. I want to see everyone who hasn't said anything yet.
There's the recurring theme that the virtuous wife is one who works hard for her family.
Definitely. So yeah, that's a big theme. You see that diligence throughout there. And that would be, taking all of Proverbs in a context and in mind, that would be as opposed to the sluggard, who is not getting out of bed early in the morning like the excellent wife is doing, who is not doing all of these great and productive things that the excellent wife is doing either. So for NASCAR's question, we're in Proverbs chapter 31, verses 10 to 31. We just read it. You can probably skim through it. And we have four options for you guys to take. You could summarize it, you could give an application, ask a question, things like that. So before we get to Roro's, let's look at the previous ones. So Beget asked first while we were reading, what would be the equivalent of lamps today? What do you guys think? So in other words, this is a great passage, but it's in the context of, whenever King Lemuel wrote this, which was before 700 BC. So how do we apply that verse to our lives? Especially for women and women and wives out there. And for men, to look for a wife who would do that kind of thing. That's verse 18, by the way. She senses that her gain is good. Her lamp does not go out at night.
Well, she, when I read it, although we can obviously take from it literally things. But I always looked at it in a way of like summarizing a woman of godly character. So, what kind of woman stays up late and wakes up early to work hard? A diligent one that's not lazy. It's almost like it's summarizing all the different things we learned, not all of them, but a lot of the ones that we learned throughout the book of Proverbs. You know, about diligence, which is the opposite of laziness, about faithfulness, fear of the Lord. You know, all of these different topics are kind of summarized in this woman, which is kind of ironic because wisdom is personified as a woman. Wisdom is personified as kind of like a motherly sort of woman that's saying, come learn of me and I'll teach you wisdom. So I think it's fitting that it starts and ends that way. Yeah. Also, to answer your question, baguette, what's the equivalent of a lamp today is probably just something like a light. I don't know. Like I've got
Paying
a
your
desk
electric
lamp.
bill.
Yeah.
That was just a joke. But yeah, to add on to that a little bit, I like that you said is some kind of almost summarizes, maybe even the culmination of the whole book of Proverbs. And I would definitely agree with that. It's a fitting end to the book of Proverbs, definitely. And then for the lamp question. In the context of this, I don't think it's simply talking about light. So if we look at, in that same verse 18, she senses that her gain is good. So she's being productive and she's making sales, right? She's making sales with the things that she's making, or earnings from the vineyard and things like that. And then in verse 19, she stretches out her hands to the distaff, which is, I think, a part of a spindle, and her hands grasp the spindle. So I would say that we're in the context of being productive, and in order to be productive at night, you would have to have a lamp. You'd have to have light at night there. So I would say the principle that you could still apply today is to just be productive, even if that means working in the evenings. And of course, you know, the evenings back then, they got very dark, and they didn't have fancy street lights or anything like that, so they'd probably have a lamp out much earlier than we would. Maybe turn a light on, or maybe, depending on your area, then you might have the light on a little earlier. So it doesn't mean, you know, staying awake all night or anything like that, but it just means diligence. So Roro brought up a nice paragraph there. I think it's a passage which we can use to re-evaluate modern and Christian ideas of womanhood. That's excellent, yes. There's the trend of Christian women being only stay-at-home mothers, but this shows that it's not an evil thing for a Christian woman to work. Of course, it's different with children, but work in general should not be demonized among Christian women. Yeah, that gets into some controversy. But either way, we do see the woman working, right? She's getting earnings from a vineyard. She's even going out to sell some of her wares. So we do see that kind of entrepreneurial spirit, that kind of working spirit where she is earning things. So yeah, it's very interesting.
Do you mind if I like add on to you, Mark?
Go ahead, NASCAR.
Like, you know how I said, like, you know, it's common to see, like, you know, a woman working, like, you know, a godly woman. Well, unfortunately, these days, you know, you kind of have to have two people work two jobs, because I'm talking about one for the husband, one for the wife, because, you know, if you don't, then you're not going to get any income for your housing or anything. But, you know, I really think, you know, it's the most beautiful line of work is probably trying to share the will of God. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's really good stuff. And you brought up a good point there, right? It depends on your circumstances and your context as well. Perhaps you live in an area that does require both parents to be working. Perhaps you live in an area, or you have the means or the budget so that the woman doesn't have to be so much of a provider, and the man's kind of doing this while the woman is teaching the children, spending a lot of time with the children, maybe even homeschooling as well, which takes a lot of time. So that's another option too. And I don't think we're getting commands here either way, in that the wife should be out working and providing for the family. It just shows that as an option, at the very least, in this context. Either way, being diligent is what's important there. And Hat says, I'd still say she still has to prioritize raising her children. And yeah, in making applications, we should also keep in mind the fuller context of the Bible and all the passages that do address families and how families should work, what the husband should be doing, what the wife should be doing, what the children should be doing. So that's good too. And Roro says, doesn't the godly woman working through the night conflict with the proverb or psalm about God giving his beloved rest? And that's an interesting question there. I don't think rest excludes work, unless you're talking about the sluggish kind of rest that we shouldn't be engaging in. But I would say that you can still be restful when working. You can still be at peace while working and not consumed by anxiety, consumed by stress, and consumed by all of that stuff that would be against rest. And at the end, NASCAR brought up a really good point. He said that he thinks that some of the best kind of work you could do would be sharing the gospel, bringing out the word to people and things like that. And I think that's good. That gets into some of the commands that we see in the New Testament, such as Matthew 28, 19 and 22 and so on. Go therefore, make disciples, baptizing them, teaching them, sharing the gospel with them. It's really good stuff. And that's something everyone can do too. Yeah. And I think most people brought something up for that. A couple people haven't, but maybe they're driving or something like that. I know Bern has been traveling, so she's been unable to participate too much, but that's all right. Any final questions or thoughts on this last section and on the whole passage we read, starting in chapter 30 and then chapter 31? Any final thoughts you guys want to bring up before we close this out? Also, stay for the last little bit because we will do a vote for the next study. Yeah, Malky brings up a really good point there. I think you meant to say verse 30, but it's very close. Just a little typo maybe. So verse 30, charm is deceitful, beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. So from the summary that we did, if you remember at the beginning of the study, I said that when we were commenting on chapter 1, verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, that it was the motto of Proverbs, and that you'd see it repeated here and there throughout the book of Proverbs. And here it is again, right at the end, just one verse before the end, but pretty much at the end, as a very fitting conclusion that ties this whole thing together as one complete work. So, we have good words of King Lemuel. We have good editors on the book of Proverbs, collecting Agur's words and King Lemuel's words and Solomon's Proverbs. And those editors were the men of Hezekiah. It's mentioned in chapter 25, verse 1. But yeah, really good stuff. Deza says it makes him wish more people feared the Lord. Even so many Christians seem to just not give him respect for his work. Yeah.
To be honest, I really think, adding on to that statement, mean that, here, hold on a minute. Let me get my dog off my bed. Get off my bed. Anyway, I think what he means is like there are people who claim to be Christian that like we said a few times back that aren't really Christian. They just claim to be, like, say they follow him but never really accepted Jesus into their life. That's why they're still living most of these like horrible lives. And yeah. So for people to fear the Lord, my thing is like, just fear is to fear is fear evil. Sorry, Mark. Hold on a second. Dog just jumped back off of my bed. Anyway. But anyway, like I said, fearing the Lord, I think what Matt said, like, I believe Matt had it on his status a few months back. I think Matt had the stats a few months back saying, fearing the Lord means turn away from all evil. And which is why, I really think, that turn away from all evil is what, I really think would, to be honest, mean like murder, things like that. But what it really means is like just trying to turn away from your sinful ways and as a new thing. All right, I'm just going to mute my mic. I'm sorry.
No, it's all right. But yeah, you brought up some good points there. And yeah, there are non-Christians who claim that they're Christian, who don't fear the Lord at all. And I would say that from, I think, Dez's comment, yeah, there are also Christians, immature Christians, who are supposed to be fearing the Lord but aren't really doing that as well as they could be. Either way, though, you look at all the Proverbs and you see some great advice on how to fear the Lord. So positive things for you to be actually doing, and negative things that you should be staying away throughout Proverbs in order to fear the Lord better. But it should spur us on to action. So that's good stuff. All right. I think we can close it out then. Dogman, could you please finish us off with a word of prayer?
Dear Lord, thank you for this Bible study. Thank you for our internet and our ability to join together in this server. Thank you for bringing us all together in this server and in this Bible study today. Help us apply what we learned and into our lives, and to give us more wisdom throughout the week and throughout our lives. Help us to grow in love towards you and in obedience to you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. All right. Now we're going to vote on the next study. We might be able to do a topical study if you guys want to, but I'm really looking for a book of the Bible. So write your suggestions down there, and then I'll put them all together into a poll, and we can vote.
Have we done Matthew yet?
Not yet, I don't think.
Because I actually would not mind like doing a book of Matthew, but like I say, I can't really be in here that much because, for whatever reason, for Discord VC chats, usually they just go black, and they just go like black, meaning like it just flashes black and then goes back on, so I can't really be in here. So that's why, like, I'm not really in here all that much, but yeah.
That's all right. So we got Matthew down. We got Genesis suggested as well. Any other suggestions? Ephesians, it's another good one.
Sorry, not muted.
It's all right. Oh man, we're getting some really good ones. Fang's still recommended in Revelation. Ecclesiastes, Habakkuk, Hebrews. We already did a study on Hebrews, but that is a great book. If I were to do Revelation, it would probably be mostly just me giving the various options. I don't want to get too controversial there. So we did do a study on Romans already, but another excellent book. All right, I think I have all of the options written down here. Let me just put some emojis on.
I think also like we could also maybe have a night, like not specifically Tuesday, but we could do a night discussing like, other religion movements, like for example, like the cults, which I consider like Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, like what they believe.
Yeah, that's another option. So I have the poll up now. So just go ahead and vote on that and react to the message. Just put your reaction on there for whatever book you want.
How many can we vote for?
You can vote for 2 at most.
Awesome.
So it looks like the most votes is Genesis, but the others are pretty close.
Someone wants to... Sorry.
I did 1, 2, 3, 4.
Someone wants a simultaneous Bible study.
Oh dear.
Matthew, Genesis, Ephesians, and Revelation.
All right. So, so, like, so wasn't Matthew like one of the ones who said like beware dogs, or was that Paul?
Beware the dogs?
Yeah.
There was a verse where it was talking about beware of the dogs as mutilators of the flesh, but I'm pretty sure that was talking in context about the Pharisees or the Pharisaical Christians who were demanding that Christians be circumcised in order to be saved because they wanted to mingle the law together with the
Yeah,
gospel.
that verse.
Yeah,
Also,
that was Paul.
and also, part of the reason why I say beware dogs is because this dog is literally just trying to get my popcorn. And that's part of the reason why.
I was just gonna say, I think he's trying to use the Bible against his poor dog.
Oh.
Would you believe me if I tried to do WWE moves on him?
No, don't.
Just kidding.
Poor doggy. Can I vote twice for the same book if we get 2 votes?
No, you can't, unfortunately.
Okay. Please, somebody vote for Matthew.
So we have Matthew and Genesis. They're tied right
You don't
now.
like Genesis?
8 votes each.
Been through it a lot lately, like at church, Sunday school, and somewhere else too. So
Probably the
kinda, I mean, I love
grow
Genesis. Genesis out.
Bible reading and hangout time. We're reading Genesis there
Oh,
too.
Yes.
Oh, that's right. Exactly. Yes, that's the other place. So yeah. I mean,
Okay,
it's
now we
good
got 9
stuff.
votes for both of them.
Wow.
Come on,
Still
who's doing
tied.
this? This is cruel.
Okay, this is the last Bible study where I make popcorn.
Oh, your dog. Dog
Yeah.
loves popcorn.
Yeah, I can't give him much because he already eats enough human food as is.
Oh yeah, that's not good for him. I gotcha.
My dad says you got to share with your dog. I'm like, I don't got to share everything with them.
True, especially if it's not healthy for him.
All right. So if someone...
What's going to be the tiebreaker?
Well, if anyone has voted for both Genesis and Matthew, you're going to have to remove one of your votes and vote for only one of them.
Aha.
So if you have a vote for both of them, you got to remove one of them.
And has anyone checked, like, to see if anybody's voted more than twice?
I haven't, but since it's just between Genesis and Matthew now, I think it's fine.
Well, Mark, I think you have the deciding vote because you had to start
Which
the
one
vote,
would you prefer, Mark?
so your votes don't count. You have the
I don't
deciding
know, I
vote.
like both of them. If I were voting, I'd probably abstain. So it looks like most people have voted for Genesis now that we restricted it to just one.
All right.
Sorry, Matt.
It's like 50 chapters. Wow. All right.
Most of it's narrative, though, but it'll be a lot of reading at least.
Yeah.
So, all right. Genesis it is. We'll start that next week, and I'll try to get you guys the commentary. If you want access to the commentary, just send me a direct message, and I'll just go with the old Philippian group. So if you were in those previous commentary groups, you'll get the Genesis commentary as well. I'll try to find one that isn't too, like, on one side, but gives the various sides specifically for old Earth creation versus young Earth creation. And so then we have all the options, and you can just discern for yourself and with the Holy Spirit. All right. Well, thank you all for being here. And I'll try to add you guys to the commentary groups who have mentioned it. And I'm excited for the Genesis study. Oh, it's just an online chat group where we read the commentary. And
so it's like on Discord, right?
Yeah.
You can add me there if you want to, but like I said, I'm still going to be a part-timer in here.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you all for being here. I'll see you next week for Genesis. Looking forward to it. See you guys.
Yeah. And also, guys,
See you.